All right, welcome to this explainer. Look, chess can often feel like this totally chaotic avalanche of complex concepts, right? But today, we're going to organize all of that into a structured, highly actionable masterclass. If you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of tactics, strategies, and all those unwritten rules of the game, you are absolutely in the right place. We're going to visually map out the entire game, breaking down everything you need to know to actually structure your mind and, well, crush your opponents, from the very first move to the final devastating blow.
Okay, let's take a super quick look at our roadmap for today. We've got 5 main stops. First, essential rules and conduct. Number 2, positional strategy and pawns. 3 is brutal middle game tactics. 4, the art of checkmate. And finally, number 5, surviving the endgame. Let's dive in. Kicking things off with Section 1, Essential Rules and Conduct. And our subtitle here is pretty simple. Don't be that guy. Because, hey, before you can launch a brilliant attack, you need to know how to just exist at the board without getting disqualified or looking like a total amateur. To keep things fair and respectful, you're actually expected to follow a European business casual dress code. So dress appropriately and keep the hats off, unless, of course, it's for religious reasons. But you really need to look at that third point. Never resign. If you find yourself in a totally hopeless position, do not voluntarily surrender the game. You fight until the bitter end. And if you're hopelessly losing, but your opponent is dangerously low on the clock, claiming a draw on time is an entirely valid, completely legal survival tactic. And speaking of the clock, this brilliantly illustrates how the game stops people from endlessly, agonizingly stalling. The 50-move rule gives you an out. If 50 moves pass with absolutely 0 pawn pushes and 0 captures, you have the option to call it quits and claim a draw. But if the game somehow drags on to 75 moves of absolutely nothing happening, the rules step in and forcefully pull the plug. It becomes a mandatory draw, whether you like it or not. Moving right along to Section 2, Positional Strategy and Pawns, setting the board. Now, what's really fascinating here is how we organize our pieces, and especially our pawns, before the real bloodshed begins. As you can see, not all pawns are created equal. Up at the very top, we have connected passed pawns. These guys are basically overpowered because they perfectly protect each other as they march down the board together. Step down one level and you have protected passed pawns, which are strong but need your other pieces to kind of babysit them. Then there's flank passed pawns, which are definitely harder to support but still useful. But look down at the bottom. The backward pawns. These are the pawns completely left behind, totally undefended by their pawn brothers. They're grounded, and they instantly become these giant, glowing, weak targets for your opponent to zero in on and capture. But strategy isn't just about pawns, is it? It's about matching your heavy hitters to the actual state of the board. Take bishops. They are absolute monsters in open positions. When the board is clear, they strike from miles away, locking down massive diagonals. But if the board is closed, completely clogged up with locked pawn chains, bishops become practically useless. And that's exactly when you rely on your knights. Since knights can literally hop over those blockades, they absolutely thrive in closed positions, infiltrating these hidden squares that no other piece could ever dream of reaching. Which brings us to a massively important concept to wrap your head around. 3 is greater than 1. Specifically, 3 minor pieces are usually vastly superior to 1 queen. Even though 3 minor pieces and a queen are both technically worth 9 points of material, trading your pieces away for a queen is usually a terrible idea. Why? Because 3 distinct pieces control way more squares and can coordinate these incredibly deadly, multi-pronged attacks. I mean, a single knight planted on a solid outpost can sometimes be worth more than a queen just because it completely paralyzes the enemy. All right, Section 3, Brutal Middle Game Tactics. Explosive combos. We've set the board. We know our piece values, so let's crank up the energy. We are entering the middle game now, taking a rapid-fire look at the tactics you can use to dismantle enemy lines. First up is clearance. This is all about making room. Imagine you've got a knight dying to jump to an outpost, let's say the e6 square, to deliver a massive fork. The only problem? Your own queen is sitting right on that square. Well, clearance is this brilliant move where you purposefully sacrifice the queen, getting her out of the way, specifically to clear the path and let that knight do its job. Next is deflection, and this is where the mind games really start. If your opponent has a piece guarding a critical square, say their queen is desperately defending h7 from checkmate, you basically just throw another piece right at them. You sacrifice a rook just to force that defending queen to look the other way. The literal second she abandons her post to deal with your distraction, you strike the unprotected square. Then we have interference, which beautifully illustrates how to physically break an opponent's defense. If your opponent has pieces protecting each other, you literally shove one of your own pieces right into the middle of their defensive line. By interposing your piece, you snap that visual connection between the enemy's guard and whatever it was defending. It instantly triggers a huge loss of material for them.
And wrapping up our middle game combos, we have undermining, or as it's perfectly nicknamed, removal of the guard. When you spot a really heavily protected target, sometimes the best move is to just ignore the target entirely. Instead, you aggressively chop the head off the guard defending it. Once that defensive piece is captured and off the board, the original target is totally helpless, and you just proceed with the slaughter.
So, Section 4, the art of checkmate, finishing the job. Because of those explosive combos, your opponent's defenses are now crumbling. Which brings us to the big question. How do you actually forcibly checkmate the king? Because let me tell you, you cannot play hope chess. Hope chess is when you make a move and just hope your opponent screws up. No, you have to assume they will play the absolute best defensive move every single time. So how do you navigate this wild gallery of checkmate patterns to actually guarantee a win? Let's look at some classic executions. First up is the Bowden Mate. This is just a stunning long-range execution. Your two bishops act like military snipers, bombarding down parallel diagonals. They divide the labor perfectly. One bishop locks down the escape squares so the king has nowhere to run, while the other bishop delivers the lethal checkmate. Set it up correctly, and it's an unstoppable force. But if you're more of a brute force kind of player, check out the blind swine mate. If you can manage to get both of your rooks onto your opponent's 7th rank, they become an absolute nightmare. They just march down the line, eating pawns and trapping the king like blind swine. The rooks coordinate perfectly to cut the king off completely for a suffocating mate. Now, what's really interesting about the Bowden Mate is the geometry of it all. Just imagine a pair of really sharp scissors slicing right across the board. This pattern usually kicks off with a super dramatic queen sacrifice that lures the king out into the open. Once he's exposed, the two bishops cross their diagonal attacks in an X pattern, seamlessly clipping the king's wings and trapping him entirely.
For pure elegance, we have the Opera Mate, a classic, incredibly beautiful pattern that typically happens right smack in the center of the action. It requires this perfect harmony between a rook and a bishop. The bishop stands directly behind or beside the rook, supporting it flawlessly, which lets the rook get right up in the king's face and deliver a devastating blow they just can't answer.
And rounding out our checkmate gallery today is the Morphe-mate. So here, the enemy king has been forced all the way into the corner of the board. Your rook acts as this uncrossable, solid wall, completely cutting off the adjacent file or rank. And with the king completely boxed in, your bishop swoops directly into the corner on the diagonal to finally put the king out of his misery.
Section 5. Surviving the Endgame. Welcome to the final grind.
So what happens if your opponent somehow survives that massive barrage of checkmate attempts? Well, we enter the final grueling phase. The board is mostly empty now, and every single move is a tense matter of life or death. To survive this grind, you've got to master a few tricks. First, the breakthrough, willingly sacrificing pawns or even pieces just to clear a path so one surviving pawn can promote to a queen. Second, underpromotion. Believe it or not, sometimes making a queen actually causes a stalemate, a draw. So you purposefully promote to a knight, bishop, or rook instead to keep the game alive. Third, if you're totally losing, you can spam a perpetual check. You put the king in an endless loop of checks he can't escape, forcing a draw and saving your rating. And finally, the absolute golden rule. If you have an unblocked passed pawn, push it forward immediately. I want to leave you with this final, beautiful dilemma. Zugzwang. I know, it sounds like an expensive German sports car, doesn't it? But it's actually the ultimate nightmare scenario in chess. It's a situation you engineer where your opponent is forced to take their turn, but literally every single lethal move they can possibly make will instantly ruin their position and lead to a loss. It really makes you wonder, as we wrap up this explainer, how completely, utterly dominant do you have to be to create a board state where the only winning move for your opponent is not having to move at all? Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.